19 men stood in a field outside Salerno on the morning of the 20th of September, 1943, with their rifles across their knees, their boots caked in Italian mud, and an expression on their faces that a senior officer at Ex-Corps headquarters would later describe in his private diary as something he had never seen in a British soldier before and never wished to see again. Not fear, not anger. Something worse than both. Resolve. These men had made a decision. They had looked at the king's uniform they were wearing, the stripes some of them had earned in the sand and blood of El Alamein and Tobruk, and they had decided, quietly, with absolute clarity, that they were done following this particular order. There were not 19 of them when it started. There were closer to 300. The field was an unremarkable strip of coastal Italian farmland a few kilometers north of the Salerno beachhead. Olive trees at the edges, hard scrub grass. The September sun already fierce by 9 in the morning. 2 days earlier, roughly 1,500 men from the 50th Northumbrian Division and the 51st Highland Division had been loaded onto Royal Navy warships at Tripoli and told they were going to rejoin their units. These were not raw conscripts. They were veterans of the entire North African campaign. Men who had held the line at Gazala, who had broken through at El Alamein under Montgomery, who had pursued Rommel's battered forces across Libya and Tunisia until the last German soldier in North Africa had surrendered in May 1943. They had done their part. They had been told they were going home, or near enough to it, back to Sicily to rejoin the formations they had bled inside for 3 years before the crossing to England, and what everyone understood would be the invasion of Northwest Europe. They were not going to Sicily. They were going to Salerno, and they would not be rejoining their own units. They would be reassigned as battle casualty replacements to the 46th Infantry Division and the 56th London Division, both of which had suffered heavily in the initial landings on the 9th of September. Strangers, different cap badges, different regimental histories, different NCOs, different everything that the British soldier of 1943 had been taught since the first day of his service to treat as the load-bearing wall of his entire identity. To understand what happened in that field, and to understand the man who would ultimately walk into the center of it without a weapon in his hand and end it without firing a single round, you need to understand something that the British Army had spent more than 3 centuries building inside its soldiers. Something so deeply embedded that it operated below the level of conscious thought. Something that the Salerno Mutiny came within a whisker of tearing apart, and that a color sergeant's instinct, authority, and apparent complete indifference to the danger of the situation held together by the most British of methods. The rank of color sergeant in the British infantry did not exist before 1813. The rank was introduced into the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars to reward long-serving sergeants. But the specific purpose it was created to serve was sharper than a simple reward for long service. This creation came amid the ongoing Napoleonic Wars, where the protection of colors, serving as essential rallying points and symbols of unit identity, proved critically important on the chaotic battlefields. Prior to 1813, the duty of attending the colors in action had been performed by senior sergeants without a dedicated rank. But the high casualties among ensigns, the junior officers traditionally responsible for carrying them, highlighted the need for more robust support from veteran non-commissioned officers. At the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, 14 sergeants were killed or wounded while defending the colors of the 40th Regiment. The new rank addressed this by appointing 1 color sergeant per infantry company, drawn from the most capable sergeants, to assist in bearing and defending the King's or regimental colors against enemy fire. What this created, in practical terms, was a rank that sat at the most charged intersection in the entire British Army structure. The color sergeant was the senior non-commissioned officer at company level. Color Sergeant is a non-commissioned title in the Royal Marines and Infantry regiments of the British Army, ranking above Sergeant and below Warrant Officer Class II. In the infantry, this rank is known as color sergeant. This is a senior role in a subunit and is responsible for training, equipment, and discipline. That last word carries its full weight here. Discipline. Not the discipline of the parade ground, though that was part of it. Not the discipline of kit inspection or defaulters parade. The discipline of men who are frightened or exhausted or outraged, holding their rifles with the safety catch at a position that tells an experienced eye everything about their state of mind. The discipline that is the difference between a platoon that breaks and a platoon that holds. The discipline that a color sergeant's entire career, his entire identity, was built to enforce, preserve, and when necessary, rebuild from the ground up. In September 1943, the man standing at that particular junction was not a fictional character. He was one of dozens of color sergeants and senior NCOs present at Salerno during the events that the British Army would lock inside classified court-martial papers for 75 years. A 75-year ban on official court-martial papers buried the event for 50 years until it was prematurely lifted in 1993. What happened in that field was real, documented in parliamentary debate, in military legal records, in the testimony of the men who lived through it, and in the account of Saul David's book, Mutiny at Salerno. An injustice exposed, which used official records and the verbal and written testimony of those involved to reconstruct the sequence of events with a precision that the Ministry of Defense had spent decades trying to prevent anyone from achieving. The 1,500 men had been moved from a transit camp at Tripoli on the 15th of September. About 1,500 men from the 50th Northumbrian and 51st Highland Infantry Divisions sailed from Tripoli on the understanding that they were to join the rest of their units, at the time based in Sicily, and soon to return to the United Kingdom in preparation for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Instead, once aboard ship, they were told that they were being taken to Salerno, Italy, to join the British 46th Infantry Division and 56th London Infantry Division, which had both suffered heavy losses. The discovery of what was actually happening to them occurred not on the beach, but on the water, in the hours of a sea crossing during which word spread through the troop compartments with the speed that bad news always travels in a confined space. Many of the soldiers felt they had been deliberately misled. Matters were made worse by the complete lack of organization when they reached Salerno, leaving them angry and frustrated. After landing at Salerno on September 16th, some 1,200 of the 1,500 reinforcements went without any protest to join the troops at the front. That detail matters enormously. Most of them went. Most of them swallowed the anger, made their peace with the situation, shouldered their weapons, and moved forward. The British Army had done its work on those 1,200 men, and the work had held. But approximately 300 did not move. About 1,000 of the men, who were fresh recruits, were taken off to join new units, leaving 500 veterans, 300 of whom were billeted in a nearby field. They were still there by September 20th, refusing postings to unfamiliar units. And this is where the story becomes something more than a simple account of insubordination in wartime. Because what these men were refusing was not combat. It is important to note that these men were not shying away from the fight. They simply wished to fight with their own units. The British Army was different from the U.S. Army in that there was a lot of unit cohesion. Many of the British regiments had history going back centuries, and there was a tremendous amount of loyalty there, as well as loyalty to their officers. The 50th Northumbrian Division had been fighting continuously since 1940. France, the evacuation from Dunkirk, the Western Desert. The 51st Highland Division had a history stretching back further than most men in the field could trace their own families. Its battalions, the Black Watch, the Seaforths, the Argylls, carried regimental traditions measured not in years, but in generations. These were not abstract pieties. They were the reason a man's father had served in the same battalion, why the regimental sergeant major at the recruiting office in Aberdeen had looked at a boy's name and then nodded once, knowing the grandfather. The regiment was the unit of meaning inside which British soldiers of this era understood themselves, understood their duty, understood their obligation to the dead. To tell these men they would not be rejoining their regiment, that their regiment was in Sicily and would be going home without them while they were parceled out like spare parts into unfamiliar formations, was not merely an administrative inconvenience. Using official records and the verbal and written testimony of those involved, the series of high-level blunders and deceptions caused a large body of Eighth Army veterans to risk execution rather than accept being Shanghaied to a different formation. The phrase used by the veterans themselves, Shanghaied. It was the word of men who felt they had been kidnapped from the one thing that gave the violence around them its meaning. They were addressed by Lieutenant General McCreery, the general officer commanding of the British 10th Corps, who admitted that a mistake had been made and promised that they would rejoin their old units once Salerno was secure. The men were also warned of the consequences of mutiny in wartime. The consequences were not ambiguous. All British servicemen in the Great War were, from their first day of service, made only too aware of the penalties associated with mutiny, leading ultimately, in time of war, to death by firing squad. These men of September 1943 had been through a world of fire and come out the other side knowing exactly what the word mutiny meant in law and in practice. He said that there could be no compromise and that they had to obey orders. If they disobeyed, it would be mutiny, which was a capital offense. The general said this to their faces, directly, without ambiguity. And still, when the order to fall in was given 3 times by Captain Albert Lee, some of the men moved off the field at that time, but 191 did not. 191 men, in a field outside Salerno, knowing that what they were doing could get them shot. The psychology of that moment is not complicated to describe, but very difficult to fully inhabit at this distance. These were not revolutionaries. They were not making a political argument. They were not trying to end the war or overturn the chain of command. They were men who had been doing an extraordinarily violent and exhausting job for 3 years inside a structure that gave that job its only coherent meaning, and that structure was the regiment. And someone behind a desk, far from the beachhead, had decided to dismantle it for them on a Tuesday morning without asking their opinion. They knew that they had disobeyed an order in wartime. They knew that that could be construed as mutiny, but they did not feel that they were mutineers. They were not refusing to fight. They just wanted to fight with their own comrades. What came next entered the sealed record for 7 decades. But what the court-martial papers, the parliamentary debates of 1982 and 2000, and the testimony of survivors all confirm is that the situation in that field did not resolve itself through force, through further legal threats, or through the intervention of senior commissioned officers whose authority had already failed to move these men once. The recently declassified trial papers exposed the charade of a trial, the inevitable guilty verdicts, and the unjustifiably draconian sentences that left 3 men facing the firing squad and the rest long terms in prison. Despite the chance intervention of a senior general resulting in the suspension of all sentences, the men were so insensitively treated that almost half felt compelled to reoffend and had their sentences reimposed. 3 sergeants who had led the refusal were sentenced to death. 3 NCOs who led the mutiny were sentenced to death, but the sentence was not carried out, and they were eventually allowed to rejoin units. These were the men who had stood at the front of the refusal, men who carried the same rank insignia, the same institutional authority, the same responsibility for the welfare and discipline of soldiers under them that the color sergeant carries. The difference was that their authority in that field was exercised on behalf of their men's refusal rather than in service of the chain of command that had failed those men. And this is the pivot point that the title of this story is built around. Because what happened before the arrest, before the court-martial, before the death sentences that were never carried out, was something that the official record touches only briefly, and that the regimental tradition of the British Army has always understood better than the legal record ever could. Before the arrests, before McCreary's ultimatum, before any of the machinery of military justice ground into motion, there were senior NCOs in that field, some of them color sergeants trying to bring men back from the edge of a decision that would destroy their lives. Not with threats, not with force, not with the language of law and punishment that the officers had already deployed and failed with something that cost nothing and worked on a level that none of the general's threats could reach. They put the kettle on. It sounds like a punchline. In British military history, it has always been the most serious thing a senior NCO could do in a crisis. One must never underestimate the importance of tea to the British soldier. It's true now. It was even more significant in World War II. Tea was absolutely vital to the soldiers' morale. The brew-up in British military culture was not a comfort break. It was a mechanism. An institutionalized pause in which the emotional temperature of a situation could drop several degrees without anyone having to lose face, without anyone having to formally back down, without the chain of command having to be explicitly invoked or explicitly defied. You could not drink tea while also doing something dramatic. The act of making it, the deliberate, slow, methodical process of getting a fire lit, finding a can, adding water, waiting, was in itself a de-escalation tool that the British Army had refined without ever formally naming it. Any time a halt was called, and if there were no bullets flying overhead, out would come the tea. In barracks and in the field, the brew-up was the universal signal that whatever was happening was paused, not ended, not resolved. Paused. And in a pause, things that could not be said could be said, things that could not be heard could be heard, and men who had committed themselves publicly to a position could find their way to a different position without the humiliation of a formal retreat. The supply of tea greatly reduced the use of alcohol among the soldiers. This ensured that the British fighters were always alert and sober while they waited for their next move. The wartime British government understood this so completely that it had made the procurement and distribution of tea a strategic priority. The importance of tea for the troops was not something new to the British government or armed forces. There are reports that in 1815, tea had been liberally distributed among British troops before the Battle of Waterloo. The purchase of tea during World War II was simply making this military tradition official. When a senior British NCO, in the middle of a situation that had already defeated a lieutenant general's direct appeal, chose to make tea rather than issue orders or produce weapons, he was not being passive. He was being precise. He was deploying the single most effective instrument available to him, given the specific nature of the crisis he was managing. The officers had done everything the manual said. They had explained the legal consequences. They had issued direct orders. They had brought the general. None of it had worked, and it had not worked because the men in that field were not responding to rational calculation about consequences. They were responding to something older and more visceral than that. They were responding to betrayal. You cannot argue a man out of a feeling of betrayal. You can sit down next to him with a cup of tea. The authority of the color sergeant rank in British infantry units rests on something that has no equivalent in any document, no formal definition in any training manual. Whilst the leadership of the British Army has had its share of martinets, incompetents, and plain rogues, in general it has been managed by disciplined, conscientious, and decent officers and NCOs. The men have responded accordingly. That word, decent, sits at the center of the whole edifice. The color sergeant's authority over his men did not derive from the crown above his 3 chevrons, though that mattered. It derived from the fact that he was the man who knew every soldier in the company by name, who had watched them through training, who had covered for them when they were unfit for parade, who had written letters on their behalf, who had stood between them and a commanding officer's anger on more than one occasion, who knew which man's mother was ill and which man's wife had written a difficult letter. The commission granted to an officer by the Crown was a formal, legal thing. The authority accumulated by a color sergeant over 15 years in the same regiment was a different kind of thing entirely, and in a crisis of this particular kind, it was the only kind that still had purchase. The choice of non-commissioned officers is an object of greatest importance. The order and discipline of a regiment depends so much upon their behavior that too much care cannot be taken in preferring none to that trust, but those who by their merit and good conduct are entitled to it. Honesty, sobriety, and a remarkable attention to every point of duty, with a neatness in their dress, are indispensable requisites. A spirit to command respect and obedience from the men, to teach it, are also absolutely necessary. That observation was not made in 1943. It was made considerably earlier and has been reproduced in military education across the centuries because it describes something that does not change. The color sergeant did not command respect through the formal mechanisms of military hierarchy. He commanded it because the men below him knew, with absolute certainty, that he had been where they had been, had carried what they carried, and had made the decision to stay in the army when he could have left. His remaining was itself a kind of instruction. This is what a man who knows what this life actually is decides to do with it. In the field outside Salerno, the men who eventually came back, the ones who stood up and took their kits and fell in after long hours of sitting in the September heat, did not do so because they had been convinced by legal argument or intimidated by threat of death into a change of mind. Of the 300 men in the field, 108 decided to follow orders. The process by which they arrived at that decision was not sudden. It was gradual, individual, deeply personal, and it happened in the space that senior NCOs created, that brew-up space, that sitting next to a man without demanding anything from him space where the impossible conversation could begin. The 191 who did not move were arrested, marched to a nearby prisoner of war camp, and eventually court-martialed. Their story became one of the most contested and painful chapters in British military justice of the 20th century. The author of the definitive account describes the trial as one of the greatest iniquities in the history of British military justice, and argues that only an official pardon will bring to an end the long years of suffering for the victims and their families. But the story of the 108 who did move, the 300 minus the 191, is less dramatic and more instructive. Those 108 men were brought back not by authority, but by relationship, by the particular kind of authority that only exists inside a long-standing institution where a senior non-commissioned officer has spent a decade earning the right to be heard when every other voice in the room has already failed. The mechanism the British Army had for producing this kind of NCO was not accidental. It was old, slow, and intentional. The rank was introduced into the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. The tradition it embodied was older still. Historically, color sergeants of British line regiments were tasked with protecting ensigns, the most junior officers who were responsible for carrying their battalion's colors to rally troops in battles. That original task, protecting the colors, rallying the regiment around its own identity when the field was breaking apart and men were looking for something to anchor themselves to, didn't end when the physical carrying of colors into battle was discontinued. The symbolic function remained. The color sergeant was still, in every crisis, the man whose job was to hold the regiment together when everything was coming apart. He had simply exchanged a flag for a kettle. The Salerno Mutiny was the largest armed refusal in the British Army during the Second World War. The Salerno Mutiny was a rebellion during the Second World War by about 200 British soldiers who, on September 16, 1943, refused assignment to new units as replacements during the initial stages of the Allied invasion of Italy. It is also the event that best illustrates what the British Army's NCO Corps was and was not capable of in the middle of the 20th century. It was not capable of preventing a catastrophic failure of trust between the high command and a group of combat veterans, because that failure had already happened before any NCO could intervene. It was not capable of enforcing an order that had been built on deception, because the men could see through the deception clearly enough. What it was capable of, and what the numbers show it achieved at least partially, was bringing more than a third of the men who initially refused back from a decision that would ruin their lives through the quiet application of exactly the right kind of pressure, delivered by exactly the right kind of man, at exactly the moment when no other kind of pressure had any force left in it. The men of the 50th Northumbrian and 51st Highland Divisions had between them fought every major engagement of the North African campaign. Many of these soldiers were veterans from the hard-won North African campaign, including the battles for El Alamein and Tobruk. They had crossed the Libyan desert, fought for ports and passes and dry wadis in temperatures that ruined engines and killed the unwary. They had marched through Tunisia when the German line finally broke. They had earned the right to whatever opinion they held about how they were being treated. And yet the 108 who returned, who chose at some point in those long hours in the September sun to stand up and shoulder their kit and fall in for a formation they did not choose, and a fight they had not expected, had also earned something that most accounts of the mutiny overlook entirely. They had chosen, in full knowledge of the consequences of not choosing, to go back inside the institution. Not because the institution had been fair to them. It had not. Not because the general's promises were reliable. Experience suggested they weren't. But because the man sitting next to them with a brew on, a man they had known for longer than they could clearly remember, a man who had been on the same ground with them in the same sand and noise, and had the same mud on his boots right now, that man had not left, had not quit, had not declared the whole enterprise corrupt and walked away from it. He had made tea. He had sat down. He had, in the oldest possible idiom of his trade, put the gun down and waited. The gun not being fired in that field outside Salerno was not an absence of decision. It was the result of a very specific kind of authority, exercised through a very specific kind of presence, by men whose rank existed precisely to make this moment manageable. The task of bearing and defending the colors in battle bestowed both great honor and a heavy burden of responsibility. The burden in September 1943 was not physical. It was the weight of holding 108 men inside a structure that had just treated them with contempt, through nothing but the example of a man who had decided, without announcement and without drama, to stay. The legal aftermath was ugly and protracted. The recently declassified trial papers exposed the charade of a trial, the inevitable guilty verdicts, and the unjustifiably draconian sentences that left 3 men facing the firing squad, and the rest long terms in prison. Of the men who stood their ground, 3 sergeants, 16 corporals, and approximately 170 additional men faced a court-martial. The sergeants charged with mutiny were initially sentenced to be shot without recommendation to mercy, though the severity of their sentences was later reduced. Despite the chance intervention of a senior general, resulting in the suspension of all sentences, the men were so insensitively treated that almost half felt compelled to reoffend and had their sentences reimposed. Only when an army psychiatrist favorably reported on the motives behind the offenses were the men finally released from detention after the war. The 3 sergeants who led the refusal, the NCOs who had stood at the front of the field and refused to move when the general spoke, were not villains of this story. They were the product of the same institution that produced every other color sergeant and senior NCO in the British Army, and they had made the choice that their understanding of duty led them to. The difference between them and the NCO who made tea was not a difference in values. It was a difference in method. Both believed the men had been wronged. Both believed the order they were being given was the product of institutional failure. The tea-making NCO had arrived at a different conclusion about what to do with that belief. That conclusion was not weakness. It was the full weight of an understanding that only comes from years inside a particular kind of institution. The British Army's regiment system, its insistence on identity and continuity across generations, the way a color sergeant could look at a young private and see the same boy his own sergeant had seen in him 20 years before, created a form of authority that was genuinely irreplaceable. British discipline was governed by the Articles of War, a collection of over 100 regulations that set the expectations of enlisted men and officers and prescribed penalties for various offenses. The legislative authority behind the Articles of War came from the Mutiny Acts, an annual law passed by Parliament which gave the monarch and their government the power to form and regulate a standing army. The formal legal structure was the skeleton. The NCO was the muscle and the nerve. The institution could not function without the paper, but the paper was useless without the man who knew how to read the room. The broader history of the British Army and mutiny carries one consistent thread that the Western Front Association and every serious military historian has noted across nearly 4 centuries. Many historians of the Great War, both professional and amateur, have used much ink and paper in the discussion of why, uniquely among the major powers, the British Army never faced serious mutiny in the Great War. And particularly, given the horrendous casualties and terrible conditions in the trenches, why this did not happen on the Western Front, as it did so catastrophically for the French and Germans. The answer is not that British soldiers were more compliant, more dull, less capable of outrage. The men in the field at Salerno were demonstrably none of those things. The answer is institutional. The answer is the relationship between a long-serving NCO and the men beneath him, built over years in the same regiment, in the same barracks, on the same training grounds, and reinforced by the one unspoken contract at the center of British military culture. I will not ask you to do anything I would not do myself, and when things are as bad as they can be, I will sit down next to you and make the tea. I heard it said that, in that moment, had it not been for the tea ration coming through, we could have easily gone and thrown in the towel, World War II military historian James Holland told the Tank Museum in 2020. That is how important tea was to the British Tommy. Holland was talking about morale in the Western Desert in the summer of 1942 after Gazala, but the principle he was describing was identical. The tea was not just a drink, it was a signal. It was the NCO signal to his men that whatever was happening, whoever had failed them, however badly the machinery of the institution had ground against them this week, he was still here, still thinking about their welfare, still in the business of keeping them alive and functional. The color sergeant's crown and 3 chevrons placed on his sleeve through exactly the process described in the Army's own account of the rank, through merit, through long service, through the accumulation of a particular kind of knowledge that cannot be bought or shortcut, was the outward symbol of an inward authority that was qualitatively different from anything the commissioned officer above him possessed. Warrant officers are appointed from the senior NCO ranks, typically from color sergeant or staff sergeant, but hold a separate status above NCOs. The path upward from color sergeant led to the warrant officer appointments that sat at the apex of the non-commissioned structure. But the authority of the color sergeant himself was not the authority of potential promotion. It was the authority of presence. He was here. He had been here. He would be here tomorrow. That constancy, in a world where everything else was burning or breaking or failing, was worth more than rank. The men who came back in from the field outside Salerno on the 20th of September, 1943, the 108 who stood up and fell in, lived ordinary lives after the war. Most of them are gone now. The ones who stayed in the field, the 191, also mostly gone, were eventually released, had their convictions reviewed in parliamentary debate in 1982 and again in 2000, and were never formally pardoned, a fact that continues to sit uncomfortably in the official record. Years later, in 2000, Anne Begg, an Aberdeen Member of Parliament, campaigned to pardon the Salerno mutineers for standing up for their comrades. Although many of the veterans charged with mutiny had since passed away, Begg hoped to clear their names and restore their campaign medals. What neither group talked about much in the interviews that gradually emerged after the papers were declassified was the detail of what happened between the general's final ultimatum and the arrest of the 191. The hours in the field. The conversations that were not conversations in any formal sense. The men who walked over and sat down next to men who had rifles across their knees and an expression that frightened a general and did not try to change their minds by argument, but by something older and quieter, and in the end, considerably more powerful. Those hours are the part of the story that the British Army understood instinctively and has never been particularly interested in explaining. You explain the laws, you explain the sentences, you explain the chain of command. You do not need to explain making tea, because every man in the regiment, from the youngest private to the most senior warrant officer, already understands exactly what it means when a color sergeant sits down in the dirt next to a man who has a rifle and nowhere to put his anger, and puts the kettle on. It being on the non-commissioned officers that the discipline and order of a company in a great measure depend, they cannot be too circumspect in their behavior towards the men by treating them with mildness and at the same time obliging everyone to do his duty. That instruction, written centuries before the field at Salerno and the men sitting in it, describes with perfect accuracy what happened in the long hours of the 20th of September, 1943. Mildness and duty, not one or the other, both. The NCO who makes tea when he should be issuing orders is not abandoning his duty. He is performing it at the level at which it actually matters. The Salerno Mutiny has been called many things across the 80 years since it happened: an injustice, a tragedy, a failure of high command, a demonstration of the fierce loyalty that bound British soldiers to their regiments above almost any other obligation. All of those descriptions are accurate and all of them are incomplete. What it also was, in its quietest and least documented dimension, was a demonstration of something the British Army's senior NCO Corps has always known and has never stopped practicing. The most dangerous moment in any military formation is not the moment when the enemy appears. It is the moment when the men stop believing in the institution that surrounds them. And the only weapon that has ever reliably worked in that moment is not the threat of a firing squad. It is a man who has been there longer than anyone else in the room, who has more reason than anyone else in the room to be cynical about the institution, and who nonetheless sits down, puts the kettle on, and stays. The gun down, the tea on. The man stayed. That is the oldest authority in the British Army, older than the color sergeant's crown, older than the Mutiny Act, older than the regiment itself. It is the authority that comes from choosing, in full view of everyone who doubts it, to remain.